The rural village of Maybole, about 50 miles southwest of Glasgow, isn't where you expect to see a gruesome murder. I'm Adam Lloyd, and today I will share with you this most cowardly of crimes. 34-year-old Amjid Ismail and his family ran a grocer's shop known locally as Johnny's. They lived in the village for 20 years, and their shop played a valuable role not just in selling grocery products, but also it was a meeting place for people, as it sat in the very heart of the village and the community. On the 8th of November, his parents Mohammed, known as Johnny, and Rashida were at a passing out parade for their youngest son, Amjam, now a serving police officer. His sister is a doctor, and his brother Amir was studying to be a lawyer at the time. Amjad suffered from learning difficulties, and his parents had been building up the shop to pass on to him for his future. As the rest of the family attended the passing out parade, this left Amjad to run the store on his own, something that he'd done plenty of times before. A recent resident of Maybole was John McGeechan, having only recently moved to the area following his release from prison. In jail, he developed an addiction to heroin, and with that most addictive of drugs, he'd do anything to get the money for his next fix. At this time, he had no job and no income, and he was using four £10 bags of heroin a day. To McGeechan, the quiet grocery run by the Ishmael family looked like an easy touch, a place to rob to get some easy money. And on the 8th of November, he put his plan into place, but it didn't go as he had thought it would, and resulted in a terrible struggle with Amjid. McGeechan stabbed him 8 times and ended up leaving the grocer's shop just after 6 p.m. with not a single penny. But he did have Amjid's phone, which he had taken from him, as he had desperately tried to call the police, an ambulance to get some help. But Amjid had dialed an incorrect phone number and left a message on the answer phone of a resident of the village, which recorded in the most awful, terrifying detail the struggle with McGeechan and his cries for help as he was seriously injured in the botched robbery. McGeechan was covered in blood, and after racing away from the scene, he dumped his blood-stained jacket and the knife in bushes not far from the shop in Maybole. Meanwhile, Amjad was in a really serious condition and losing a lot of blood, having been stabbed in the neck, body, and face, and his jugular vein had been severed. A customer found him slumped in the shop, and despite being rushed to the hospital in air, the medical staff were unable to save his life. Amjid Ismail was just 34 years old when he was killed in this absolutely senseless attack. Amjad's family were very popular in the community, which was absolutely devastated by the murder. And his family knew they could never return to life as it was before, and after the attack, his family closed the shop and sold up. But what happened next was even more shocking. It turned out that John McGeechan had killed before. It had happened in February 1996 in Cranhill, a traditionally tough part of Glasgow to the northeast of the city, a community built in the 1950s to ease the post-war housing shortage. The victim in this case was 24-year-old Martin Siegerson. And after Amjid's murder, Martin's mum, Pat, later told the Daily Record newspaper exactly what had happened to her son. She said, "I remember every detail of what happened. Martin had his own flat, but he came to my house for breakfast. That's what he did the day he died. On his way, he came across some of his pals and their kids playing snowballs in the street. McGeechan had two wild mongrel dogs, and they were barking on his veranda, so Martin lobbed a snowball at them to shut them up. The snowball didn't hit the dogs, but McGeechan came out and shouted at Martin, and then lunged at his face with a carving knife. Martin punched the knife with his hand, and his finger was cut off. The knife went into McGeechan's arm, but he pulled it out and plunged it through Martin's chest, cutting his heart in half. A witness at the devastating scene picks up what happened next, saying, "I saw the boy on the ground with a girl holding his hand, telling him to keep breathing. I ran out and put a blanket around him. His eyes were open, but his mouth was gaping and he was really still. The girl opened his shirt, and there was a 2-inch stab wound to his heart with blood around it. I heard one of the ambulance crew say no response, and they put him in the back and drove off without any sirens. I think he had died instantly." It's a terrible thing to happen on your doorstep. I mean, just before that, the kids were all throwing snowballs and laughing. McGeechan was known in the community to locals as a loner who lived with his mum and had a reputation as a man to steer clear of. He was known to carry knives, and he'd threatened violence before, but the cases hadn't made it to court. When he was asked why he'd killed Martin, McGeechan replied, he just happened to be there. The police were called and went to McGeechan's flat where he was washing the 12-inch knife he'd used to murder Martin. The lead detective in the case, Brian McLaughlin, explained in his excellent book Crime Stopper how the murder was the most senseless of his career. We climbed the stairs to his flat and knocked several times on the door. There was no answer. We cautiously entered the house and found our man in the kitchen. At the sink, he appeared to be doing the dishes. Strange behaviour for someone who just killed, I reckoned. But then I spotted one of the kitchen knives he'd just been cleaning, a large knife. It looked like he'd been doing his best to cover up the crime. He continued that at first he was agitated, but by the time he'd been processed at the police station, he was very calm and accepting of what had happened. At his trial, Martin's mum, Pat, was appalled. Then rather than face a charge of murder, the lawyers reached a deal, so he was instead facing the lesser charge of culpable, which he admitted. For this, he was sentenced just 10 years in prison. Pat said, "My son's life was worth more than a miserly 10 years. He was my baby, and he was special." After being sentenced to 10 years, McGeechan was eligible for parole in 6, but he couldn't behave on the outside. He kept getting into trouble and being recalled to prison. In the end, he left prison in 2006, having served 9 years and 1 month of his sentence. It wasn't deemed safe for him to return to the close community of Cranhill, so he was moved to Maybole. Initially, he was in a hotel, but had managed to secure a council house close to where he murdered Amjid Ismail. At the trial for Amjid's murder, 47-year-old McGeechan was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. Describing him as a danger to the public and as a wicked man, the judge said to him, "You showed no mercy and used a knife repeatedly against a defenseless victim at his work. Despite his terrible injuries, he tried to summon help, but you stole the phone, taking away his only means of getting assistance." At the conclusion of the trial, in a statement, Amjid's brother Amir said, "Words cannot even begin to describe just how difficult the last 18 months have been for the family. Nobody can understand just how heartbreaking and soul destroying it is to come home and find your parents in tears night after week after month in the knowledge that there is nothing you can do to assist." There is no doubt in my mind that the individual responsible for this crime is an evil, cold, and pathetic coward who clearly has no respect or dignity towards other members of the public. Thankfully, McGeechan in prison stayed out of the news after his trial, but only until 2008. It was then reported he'd been attacked in Shotts Prison in Lanarkshire by a fellow prisoner. As he slept on a bunk bed in his cell, he was stabbed 17 times with a smashed coffee jar. It was clearly a nasty assault, and McGeechan had staples and stitches put in his face and body after being treated in hospital. And not a popular man among his fellow prisoners. A source was quoted as saying, "No one is shedding any tears over McGeechan." Indeed not. 2 men murdered for what? Nothing at all, and all those lives of the families ruined. Surely McGeechan will now spend the rest of his life in prison. Until next time, cheerio for now.